Hey everyone, here's a video I've been meaning to do for a long time, and I'm sorry it took me this long to get to it. But I wanted to talk about George Wettling's drum setup, because I was very lucky that I got to play on George Wettling's drums, thanks to the late Chuck Slate. And Chuck was a fantastic drummer who was very important on the New Jersey jazz scene in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he was friends with George Wettling, and after George Wettling died in 1968, Chuck inherited his drums and cymbals and a bunch of stuff. And by the time I came on the scene, Chuck wasn't really playing anymore. He'd had some hand injuries, and he had become a bit of a recluse. But around 2007, a mutual friend of ours put us in touch with each other. We had a very nice phone conversation, and Chuck invited me out to his place. And I spent the day with him there. We had a great time. He was very generous with his time and his knowledge. And he had George Wettling's drums just set up there in the living room. So I got to play on them. And that was obviously a great experience. So I'd like to share what I learned that day. The drums were Gretsch bass drum and tom-toms, a 12 by 22 inch bass drum, which is a really hip size, I think, sort of a narrow bass drum. Sonny Igo used that same size, 12 by 22. And you'll see a lot of those guys sometimes use a narrow bass drum. You'll see Ray McKinley and different guys do that. And Jake Hanna, who was a huge George Wettling fan, he used a 12 by 20 inch bass drum. So instead of 14, which is the standard depth. So a 12 by 22 inch bass drum, 8 by 12 and 16 by 16 tom-toms, all Gretsch, and a 5 by 14 Leedy and Ludwig snare drum. And then all the hardware on the bass drum was the kind that clipped onto the bass drum hoop. It wasn't attached to the shell. So the spurs and the tom-tom holder and the cymbal holder all clipped onto the hoop. And he had a Rogers cymbal holder. I remember that. And of course, George Wettling played many drums and cymbals throughout his career, but this is what he was using at the end of his life. And from photos and things I've seen, a pretty typical setup. The cymbals, it was 14-inch hi-hats and a 16-inch cymbal and a 20-inch cymbal. And then Chuck also had some cymbals that belonged to George, some bigger cymbals, a 19 and a 21. But I don't think I played on those. I think I just played on the hi-hats, the 16 and the 20. And these were old Zildjian cymbals, and very, very thin, and not very well-defined pingy cymbals that had a bit of a wash and a spread. If you listen, let's say, to the ride cymbal that George Wettling is using on the Eddie Condon recording, the Roaring Twenties, that to me sounds like a pingier, much more defined cymbal. It sounds different from the cymbal he's using, let's say, on the Eddie Condon recording of Bixieland. These cymbals were much more like the Bixieland kind of cymbals. But it was interesting. I've had this shown to me many times that a lot of these guys could play these very thin cymbals, yet their touch was so great that they could get a well-defined sound, and it didn't just sound like a wash. And that's a very impressive thing. And I've even more recently sat in on other people's drums where you hear them play and you think their cymbals sound one way, and then you get up there and you're playing and you realize, oh wow, that's their touch, because it's not a very precise sound. You have to control it. So I'm sure George Wettling's touch really played into how the cymbal sounded, and in fact, Jake Hanna told me that he thought that George Wettling had the greatest touch of any drummer he ever heard, except maybe Billy Gladstone. So certainly George Wettling could really get a great sound out of the instrument. And I should point out that all the heads on the drums were calfskin, and George Wettling was one of the guys who really stuck with that. By 1968, almost all drummers had switched to plastic. Very few were still playing calfskin, but George Wettling was one of them. And on the bass drum, he had a felt strip on each head, running horizontally, sort of in the bottom third of the drum. And then he had a duplex Hayne bass drum pedal with a wooden beater. And some people find the wooden beater surprising. It's really a great sound, and a lot of guys used wooden beaters. Dave Tuff, Jake Hanna used a wood beater, Buddy Rich, Louis Belson, and even guys like Stan Levy and Elvin Jones used wooden beaters. So if you've never tried one, it might seem a little scary, but it's worth at least checking out. And George Wettling also would put 2 pieces of moleskin on the bass drum right where the beater hit, and that was a very standard thing that pretty much everybody did back then. Gene Krupa, Cliff Lehman, pretty much everybody would put moleskin on the bass drum where the beater hit. You know, just regular Dr. Scholl's moleskin for your feet that you can get at a pharmacy. And that just sort of takes a little bit of the attack. It just dulls the attack a little bit of the beater striking the head. It just warms it up a little bit. And especially, guys would use that back then even if they were using a fluffy lamb's wool beater, but especially with a wooden beater, the moleskin is really nice just to have that hard beater hitting something a little softer than the drum head. Although Jake Hanna used a wooden beater and didn't use moleskin or any kind of patch on his bass drum, and he got an incredible bass drum sound. So there's a lot of ways to do this. But George Wettling always liked 2 pieces of moleskin on the bass drum. A lot of guys just put 1 piece. Chuck told me he always liked 2 pieces. And another thing that Chuck told me that George Wettling did, and had Chuck not told me this, I don't know how I ever could have possibly found this out, George Wettling would put a quarter underneath the moleskin. So there'd be a quarter up against the bass drum head and then the moleskin. So you had this hard wooden beater hitting this piece of metal, but with the soft moleskin in between. And that's really a wild idea. I mean, the only people I know who do anything kind of like that would be modern heavy metal drummers or something. So I tried it at the time, and it was kind of cool, but it wasn't something I stuck with or really worked for me, but it might be worth checking out. Definitely interesting to know. And again, I'm so indebted to Chuck. That's the kind of thing that you could only really find out from someone who was there. Otherwise, how would I ever have found that out? So that's another reason that I've been enjoying making these videos, because some of these things I was in the right place at the right time, and I happened to find some of this stuff out. So I'm happy to share it, because I know there's not a ton of people in the world who care what kind of bass drum beater George Wettling used, but there are definitely some. I know from the comments and emails I've gotten, I know that there are other people out there besides me who are interested in this stuff. So I'm happy to share it, just because things like that, you know, Chuck's gone now, and Jake Hanna, I used to be able to call up and talk to and ask him questions. He was always happy to talk. Buzzy Druten, you know, it still blows my mind that I actually got to know and hang out with Buzzy Druten, and I remember calling him up one time and asking him what bass drum beater he used. He told me hard felt. He said he never used wood. But that's another thing. If I hadn't gotten to know Buzzy, if I hadn't asked him that, it might be impossible to find that out now. I don't know how I would find that out had I not asked him. So again, I'm happy to pass this stuff along, because it's just hard to find this stuff out. Also, Wettling, at the time of his death, he was using Regal tip brushes, just regular Regal tip retractable brushes, and Regal tip JC sticks. So yeah, it was incredible to play on that stuff. Of course, it all sounded great. After Chuck passed away, George Wettling's drums went to Charlie Watts from the Rolling Stones. He has a collection, I guess, of drums that belong to a lot of great jazz drummers. And I know that Jake liked Charlie Watts, so I guess it's kind of staying in the family, which is nice. One thing unrelated to George Wettling, but one great thing that Chuck Slade also had, was he had Dave Tuff's Gretsch floor tom with the images of sort of silhouettes of dancing women on it. And you can see that photo, I mean that drum, in a ton of photos with the Eddie Condon Band after Dave Tuff died. they would use that floor tom on the stage to put their drinks on and ashtrays and things. You see that floor tom in a ton of photos, so that was also incredible to just see it there in Chuck's house. So hopefully that was helpful. I don't think I left anything out that I learned that day. Oh, yes. One interesting method for tuning the bass drum that Chuck told me that George Wettling used, and this was very interesting. Chuck said that George, once he got the bass drum, he put a new head on and he got the bass drum pretty much in tune with himself, then he would only mess with it using the top 4 tension rods. The top 2 on each side, those are the only ones he would touch if he needed it tighter or looser. And his theory was that with a snare drum or something where you need more of a precise sound, that wouldn't work. But with the bass drum, because it's so big and the tension rods are far apart, it doesn't matter so much if you get them all even. In drum tuning, we're always trying to they always tell you, get them all the same tension. But again, there's a lot of ways to do this. And that idea of just using the top 4 tension rods, it was something that I never thought of, but I've been doing it since then, and it really works. It really does for the bass drum. You can leave the others alone, and it's especially great if you're playing in a club or at a festival or something and you're not playing on your drums and there's someone playing before you or after you, you don't have much time to mess with them. Even if you just take the 2 that are on the batter side and just mess with those 2, it can really have a big effect. So that was a great tuning tip that definitely has helped me out a lot, and I recommend it. So I hope that was helpful. Again, if there's any questions or anything you have, please let me know. Also, I'm going to try to do some more videos soon. I've had a lot of very nice requests. There's still some stuff about Cozy Cole I want to do. Also had a request for Nick Fatul, another one of my favorites. All these guys were so great, so I'm happy to talk about any of them. And also Cliff Lehman. So definitely want to do that. And again, through great fortune, I happen to own a few pieces of drum equipment that actually belonged to Cliff Lehman. So I'll definitely be showing those. And I have these. I wanted to also just recommend a few more George Wettling recordings, because why not? This one features some George Wettling artwork, but this one I kind of have to just point out that even though his artwork is on the cover and it's listed that he's on this is actually Buzzy Druten on this recording. So that's always been kind of a pet peeve of mine. I just wanted to point that out. But this recording, Brother Matthew with the Eddie Condon Band, fantastic record. Highly recommend it. George Wettling sounds great on there. I think it's also on YouTube. You can listen to it there. And here's another one. Pee Wee Russell Plays Pee Wee. Great stuff on here. Some of my favorite playing by George Wettling. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.